Robin, the floor is yours. Everybody knows
Okay.
Robin McDonald, right? You just introduce yourself.
Yes, I think everybody knows me, but I made the mistake last meeting at the BZA, and I didn't say who I was, and Bob's like, you need to introduce yourself. Like, oh, sorry. I'm Robin McDonald, the zoning manager, and been here since the inception of the city, so hopefully I can help with training. I heard that people wanted to know more about our form-based code. I know you guys work with it a lot as far as when you do plan review of your building, especially as well as LDPs and all that kind of stuff that you review. So here we go. So just some background first. Typically zoning when before we adopted the form-based code in two areas, in Deerfield and Crabapple, we had fairly traditional, conventional codes where you look at the use and then how to administer it and then the form. And it's called Euclidean zoning in that it separates, you don't want to have houses next to manufacturing or stuff like that. So that's typically how most zoning ordinances are set up, is to separate uses, and then you typically have uses that are similar or a good transition. But with form-based code, you look at the form or the building or of the form of the building, and then you look at the use and then the administration of it.
Can you define administration a little bit?
So basically, just looking at what is required to be done to be able to put it onto the ground, basically. So,
like permits?
Permitting, zoning. I mean, like in form-based code, it's like master zone, so you don't really have to worry about the zoning section of it, whereas in conventional code, a developer would say, I want to build, subdivision with 50 houses with quarter-acre lots with X number minimum square foot house. So they come to me and say that's what they want to do, and say, well, okay, let me figure out which code works, which zoning district works for what they want to do. And then form really doesn't even go into it. It's just they build whatever they build. So that's the explanation of administration. So. It focuses on shaping the form, the built environment, the exteriors, the placement of buildings on their lots, the design of streets and public spaces. And just to be clear, it's not to be confused with design guidelines or overlay districts. It's not advisory, but it is an actual zoning district. So when we did the first one in Crabapple in 2012, it was a master zoning procedure where I'll get into some more detail, the process of that. So it's not advisory, it's regulatory. It can be presented, the form-based code can be presented in both diagrams and words. A form-based code does not have to have drawings, and the drawings or diagrams are never legally defensible, but the text always supersedes the drawings. And it's usually key to a regulating plan. And so what a regulating plan is, basically a zoning map, what we would know as a zoning map. So this is an example of, first of all, before you get to the regulating plan, you have a plan or a vision, which is on the left, and then you create the code or the regulating plan, which is outlined on the right. This is a snapshot of a regulating plan in Crabapple. So you can see that you have the streets, the public streets. The yellow is actually proposed for future streets. And in this T3, this is Heritage at Crabapple, actually. And so we did create a new street system back there that eventually, when this parcel in the front gets developed, that they would be required to come and finish out that road and allow for another connection onto Crabapple. So it's it's a zoning map, but it's also showing where we want to have future roads. It's pretty uncommon to have a publicly built road, and typically it's built by developers. I mean, I will say we're a little different because we just built Heritage Walk as a public project, as well as there's going to be the northeast connector, which will be created over on the east side. Again, that'll be built by the public with the developers or landowners donating the land. That's correct, right? We're not purchasing the land. We've got them to donate it. So we're really have a great deal there with, because usually we have to buy the right of way. So again, we look at public spaces, civic sites, greenway trails. So the green is kind of depicting a general idea of how we would want the greenway to go. So you see how it comes through this area that's an electrical easement, power easement that bisects that part of Crabapple. Intensity zones. So just you see that it's more the T4. If you look at the chart, it's more dense than what a T3 is. So that's just a snapshot of one of the regulating plans. So form-based code is based on traditional neighborhood development, or T&D, and the idea is having it designed for a human scale, focusing on walkability and connectivity, looking at the public spaces, having them really high quality where people are attracted to those spaces, not just somewhere that's there and nobody goes to visit it. It's a mix of uses, again, going back to the form and not, being super concerned about, okay, well, there's going to be office building here, there's going to be a store here, there's going to be houses here, but the intent is when the buildings, especially in the higher density, are built, that they can be intertwined, whether it's office or whether it's retail or whether it's a restaurant. And then placement of parking lots and garages are away from the street and tucked behind buildings as much as possible. Again, like I mentioned, there's a mix of housing styles, types, and sizes, and then incorporating different environmental features in the design if that's possible. We'll go over some examples of that. So the SMART code, so you hear about form-based code, and that is derived from what's called the SMART code, and it's a model code. So there's a lot of different jurisdictions that do have form-based code. Over 350 communities. There's some in Cherokee and Cobb, including Woodstock. And so the SMART code creates a generic traditional neighborhood development. So it needs to be locally customized. So it's no different than if you go and, if you customize anything, that has to happen for this SMART code. So in our case, we did have exactly that done. Form-based features are looking at the site plan, the width sizes of lots, the block sizes of the development, the building type, the setbacks and heights, the building placement, the parking placement. And basically, the applicant shall meet the minimum code requirements, but can use their own design ideas to kind of fill in the blank. So it's I don't want to say guideline because it's zoning requirements, but then so long as that they work amongst the requirements, then they can use their own creativity to create what they want to see. At Deerfield and Crabapple, I'll get in a little bit more detail about Crabapple's a bit more, has more restrictions or requirements than Deerfield does, especially when it comes to architecture. So we have different transect zones, and as you look across here, there's a natural zone. We start with a T2 or a rural zone, and we go all the way up to T6 in Deerfield. But the first one, let's see. So basically you can see in the diagram it's very less dense, and then as you go to the right, it becomes more dense and more urban feel to it. So the left is the least dense, and to the right is more dense. So to review through it, I'll just go through this quickly. The T2 is a rural zone, utilizing the the natural environment, not the built environment. So what we use this T2 is, we have it mostly here in Crabapple. It's like a holding pattern of what was AG1. So a T2 requires 1 acre lots. They have the same setbacks as AG1. So there's areas still in this Crabapple area that does not have sanitary sewer, and so therefore they're required to have 1 acre lots. So that's our kind of holding pattern for AG1.
Where would that be?
So right across the street from the high school, above the Baptist church, there's a big parcel there below Kensington Farms. So that's probably the most known area of being unsewered.
T2 along Mayfield.
And then there's some T2 on the furthest eastern part of Mayfield, and then Broadwell. Yes, no,
In the
the lower,
backside of,
yeah, the mid Broadwell.
In Charlotte.
Yeah, down Charlotte.
Yeah.
That's right. There's some T2 down there. Yeah. So there's not a huge amount, but there is some. So the next step of density is T3. And what's interesting is we don't really, if you look at the code, we don't dictate minimum lot sizes. We just give all these parameters, and whatever size that ends up being, that's what it is. It's kind of a little counterintuitive what you're used to with traditional zoning, where, okay, you have to have minimum, 18,000 square foot lot, or minimum 32,000 square foot lot, or 1 acre. That's not how form-based code works, but it's dictated by the different requirements like setbacks. So here is actual pictures of a T3. It is in Crabapple, and I refer to it later, but it is more suburban, and they are allowed to. You can have front loading, that's one of the things, but most of our T3 does have at least side loading in the third layer, or have a detached garage. So we try to really downplay the garage portion of it. T4, get up higher in density. Again, this is T4 over in Highway 9 on Webb Road, the Kensley subdivision. So you can see it's tighter lots, but there's a lot of amenities and open space. We require open space for all projects that are 4 acres or more to be implemented, and just not like a little space behind something, but to be usable, to be used by the public and by accessible to the public, so they don't feel like, oh, it's just for their subdivision. That's the other thing, is we don't allow gating of subdivisions in the form-based code. So we want everything to be interconnectivity, both with vehicles as well as pedestrian. T5 is, example across the street is the Crabapple Mercantile. Again, it's going to be higher density, and this is where you really start getting into mixed use. There's some in T4 as well, but we really encourage vertical mixed use with the T5, because you can have this additional density going on. T6, we have this over in Deerfield area. There's no T6 in Crabapple. And so obviously this is more urban. You got the office buildings. I think we can go up by right up to 12 stories in a T6 in Deerfield. And then, so that's pretty tall. I think our highest buildings is maybe 4 or 5 stories. So we still have quite a bit to go. And again, most of that had already been developed in Fulton County. So that's the T6.
But that could be tear down.
Definitely. I mean, we would love for Verizon to redevelop their properties, because it's very, not being used in a great way. It's a lot of parking. They don't really utilize parking decks. It's, I think, 3 or 4 stories, but we haven't convinced them yet to totally.
In the future, that's there.
It can, yeah, as well as any of it, like where our old city hall was. It's a one, yeah,
You're gonna start to see land values go up, people are gonna buy it and say, oh, it's just like
Right.
it down here. Land values start shooting up, people are gonna come in and say, we want more density, we can have more height.
yeah. So that's ready and waiting for anybody who is willing. I mean, there's actually a fair amount of land that's undeveloped, so that even in T6, so you wouldn't even have to necessarily do infill. So the advantages of the smart code is it codifies the community vision, promotes a distinctive, attractive community with a strong sense of place, makes development decisions predictable, fair, and cost-effective. And I think a biggest reason for that is that, like I said, this was all master zone. So if a developer comes in to choose a development that's 80% of our uses are by right. So they can just come to Bob and to us and they say, this is what we want to do with this 3 acres of land. Let me look at the code, get my land planner together. We look at what the code requires. They come in and talk to us and we review the code and their plan. And it's like, okay, well, that's okay. You have a concept plan. And then we look at architecture. And then, they come to you for your architecture to get the final review. So they never, other than with you all as an advisory board, they don't have to go before the mayor and city council or planning commission. They can do it all by right. And so that's a huge advantage, I believe, for whether it's residential or non-residential.
So if I was in T3
Mm-hmm.
and I just wanted the development is a little bit larger, needed more density, is that where I buy my TDRs? Is that where that comes into play?
Yeah, and there's a cap on the TDRs. So I think T3 it's 5 units per acre, I believe. And then I think the TDRs go up to 9. I mean, like I said, the T3 tends to be a little bit more suburban. I mean, and the problem with T3 is you don't have a lot of uses that are permitted that are non-residential.
Right, so you wouldn't need a lot.
Yeah, you really typically wouldn't need a lot of density under the T3, but I think it happens a better advantage in the T4 and T5 to be able to buy TDRs, and then especially in T5, you can really work with mixed use, and because you can't double dip. You can't say, okay, let's say if you had 10 acres and it was T5 is 9 units per acre times 10. I'm just looking at residential, that's 90 units. So you can't say I get 90 units plus I get the non-residential density, which it gets a little complicated. Each unit equals 2,250 square feet. So we get to use our middle school math or whatever. So if you had 10 acres, so you do 2250 times 9, and that's around 20,000 square feet, and multiply that by 10, so you're at 120 by 10, you're at 200,000 square feet, right? Something like that. So it's a math equation. So you can't do 200,000 of non-residential and then however many 90 units or 100 units of residential. You have to do a calculation to split it. So
T3 is 3 and 6 with TDR, which is up to 6. You get 3 more. T4 was the 5 and 9, which was
Right.
what Robin said. And then the T5 is 9 up to 14.
right.
So each unit, if you do a residence, we don't care how large it is. That's 1 unit. 1 dwelling unit is a unit, no matter how big or small. And then each commercial space, Robin
Right.
said, is 2,250 square feet.
Yeah.
Commercial space.
Right, per unit, and then you multiply it by
Any non-residential.
5 or 9 and then times the acreage. So, yeah.
Could you help me on by use and by right and all these words? But we get to us on exteriors. What amount of input can we give on exterior architecture? I mean, if they come before us with something we're negative on, do they have the right to do it and we have no right to change it or talk
You
about
They
it?
come to
you haven't
us.
gotten to it yet. I think you're gonna
Yeah,
get
yeah,
to
I'm
that.
gonna talk about
Let her
that.
finish. She'll talk about that.
Definitely, if there's anything else that needs to be answered, I'll be happy to, anything else that needs to be asked, I'll be happy to answer it.
I think you have something in there.
Yeah. Okay. So just as a background, Crabapple was the first form-based code that was accomplished, and it was based on the 2011 Crabapple visioning study that Lou Oliver created. And there was a lot of public meetings and charrettes that kind of got input about the area. And based on that plan, then we hired something Spangler Walsh, Tunnel Spangler and Walsh, but TSW, and they did created our form-based code, and it was adopted by the mayor and city council in June of 2012, and it contains T2 through T5. There are certain subdivisions. This is the regulating plan in front of you. So this T4 restricted, which is Crabapple Crossing or station, they said we just want to keep our own zoning. So that's what that T4 restricted means, that the underlying regulations still apply. T4 open, you're like, well, what's the difference between T4 and T4 open? There's a little bit more uses that are permitted by right in T4 open than there is in T4. And then there's some other areas you can see, Kensington Farms, and then I believe that's Six Hills up there. They just, even though they're in the Crabapple form-based code area, they just kept their original zoning. And so Kensington Farms is R2 and Six Hills is AG1. Same thing with,
Waterside?
which is it called?
Is that Waterside?
Yeah, Waterside. They had a CUP, which is a community unit plan that was done in Fulton County. They kept it as well. But for the most part, the central part, and then along Arnold Mill has the form-based code, and you can see the bright green. We talked about the T2, and then across the street from the middle school was T2 as well, and some going up Mayfield. So those are that's the regulating plan for Crabapple. We haven't ever amended that regulating plan, so it's been the same for the last 7 years, and I think it's worked really well to get our development going. So this is, it's a little hard to see, and I'll be happy to send you the link for our PDF for this. But here on the left is the uses. So if you look at it, this is for Crabapple, and I only did a snapshot of mostly the residential, but you can see there's all the transect zones along the top, and then the different uses, and it says R and R. There's a few places that says U, and that means a use permit. So if anybody wants to do apartments here, they would have to go before the mayor and city council and ask for a use permit for apartments, and so that's just an extra process that's required. So here, we allow what we call them row houses or townhouses. They're allowed by right, but if we look at the Deerfield, they're not allowed by right. They have to have a use permit that requires mixed use, except for I think T4 may not require it, but the higher densities do. So that's where we look first when somebody calls us, says we want to do X, Y, or Z. We look at the use. And then at the top, you'll see R is allowed by right, W is allowed by warrant, and U is a use permit. So a warrant is a type of administrative variance. So it's the director of community development makes a determination whether a use, there's certain uses, and it's not shown here, but that is by warrant only. So it's like a case-by-case situation. So we really don't have, for uses, I don't even think that we've even ever allowed a use by warrant that I can think of. So we just don't. I pretty much, when people call up and they want to do something, and I pretty much like, well, It's a lot of convincing you have to do, and typically that doesn't happen. Okay, so on the right is table 10 is the code summary, and this is where we look at, again, I don't have a huge, it's only a little bit of the table, but you can see that it has the density and the TDRs, and let's say a block size. It requires, so a block, literally the 4 sides of the block has to be minimum that size if you're going to create a new development. So, anyway. And there's a lot more regulations as you go further down the page, but I only captured that. So in Crabapple, the T5 is example of it is the Crabapple Market. T4 is Brayburn and the Crabapple Crossroads. So this is these new townhomes just over here. And then a lot of the Crabapple Crossroads. Some of it was developed under Fulton County, but probably the majority of it was done under our form-based code. And so luckily what was proposed by Fulton County was pretty close to what we would require for the form-based code, but it was really... So what happened was that was right as we were coming out of the recession that this area was being developed, and Bob worked with the developers because in a minute I'll show you what was required for architecture, especially in Crabapple, and they were kind of like balking, like, well, we can't do this, we can't do that. And it's like, no, this is what the code requires, minimum. And so Bob just helped them to see that if you invested $5,000 of extra architectural additions that really made the house special, then you could maybe sell it for another $20,000. And so after they saw that happening, then they were more open to the input of, the code said it, but it's really great to have somebody on the ground to say this is how it can be applied, and it can be done in a way that will help you make even more money. So not that that's the point of form-based code, but it makes it better for the developers. So this is T3. I mentioned Heritage at Crabapple. This was the first brand new from the ground up residential subdivision under the form-based code. And I think it turned out really, really nicely. It's just, I don't know if you guys have driven back there in that subdivision, but there's some really nice open spaces, public spaces. I go there, if I drive through to go look at something, I see kids playing in the greens, throwing footballs and frisbees. So it's not just an open space, but it actually gets used by the residents and other people who want to come by. So I think and if you look, there's a lot of detail. So this actually was the model home for the development, but you see how they have the stone hedging along the sidewalk, and then other areas have, the vegetation as the edging, and just there's so much detail. The driveways have brick inlay in it. Some of them have grass in between the tire treads. It's just, I think it makes it for a really special space. So, for Deerfield, again, this was our second form-based code. It was adopted, well, first of all, our area master plan, or our LCI, was adopted in 2012, and then it only went up to Bethany Bend. So in 2014, we did a vision plan for Highway 9 North to the Forsyth County border. And then we adopted the form-based code in 2013 and did some amendments in 2015 to catch up with the Highway 9 North section. And again, as I said, it goes from T2 to T6. There is one special district, is the NUP, which is the development across from Cambridge, and that was in the midst, the developer wanted to go ahead and pursue it through a zoning process instead of having it part of the form-based code. So that's a little anomaly to that. But for the most part, it's all the traditional transect zones. And again, this is another snapshot of what Table 10 of the uses, and then the code summary, which is the matrix of the development standards. So some examples of the T4 open or T4 is Kensley on Webb Road. And again, I think a really unique development in the sense that there's some beautiful architecture, there's some really great open spaces. This is their detention area that Bob helped them create into a open space, civic space for people to visit. Here's their pool. And then we haven't done a ton of commercial in Highway 9, but Pikes was probably the most recent and one of our largest developments. And again, I think it turned out really well with, having them, what they brought in, Bob can attest to, was basically just, their normal Pikes nursery that wasn't anything great. And he and other staff really helped them to make a C or B project, really an A project, based on the form-based code requirements, as well as helping them out with different aspects of the development. So I think it's a really... So in regards to the design review board, I'm just going to go over some the architectural requirements. So in Crabapple, it requires for all types of structures, including single family, all but detached single family are reviewed by the DRB. And there are 7 various architectural styles to choose from for Crabapple. So these are the 7. I'd say the most popular would be the vernacular, right? Bob, I think that's what typically people or developers look to, is the vernacular. And then Greek Revival, Italianate, Gothic, Queen Anne, Colonial Revival, and Adams Federal. And Crabapple is much more specific about materials, window type, so that's what the developers have to follow, is to be able to meet those minimum standards. So, and then in Deerfield, again, it's required for all types of structures, including single family. All but detached single family are reviewed by you all. And as I said before, requirements are more general than in Crabapple. So that's what I have. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. Charlie, if there was anything else that, I don't know if that answered your question or not, but I'd be happy to.
No, I understand the 7, we'll call them looks.
Right.
But how much conversation, because some developers are real good at doing great design, some aren't. And so when it comes to us, how much input do we have in those materials, our looks, or the way it's handled?
Well, I think, like I said, Crabapple is very specific with the architectural, rounded downspouts. I mean, you can't just have the cheapest downspouts and gutters. I mean, if you read through what is required, it's pretty specific. So I think if they follow that, then I think it comes out to be what we want the result to be, the end product.
There's several pages of architectural standards that are outlined in this code, and they're very specific to the Crabapple area as far as the materials, what it should be. And then, of course, it relates back to the different styles, but it will say, if you have a roof, it needs to be this. If it's a foundation, it needs to look like this. So it's very specific. Windows, very specific on windows. They have to have true divided lights or simulated divided lights, that kind of thing. So it does give a higher grade of architectural products.
As long as they're staying within those guidelines.
But they stay within so when I review it initially, I make sure that all of these guidelines are being upheld.
Well, except they're not guidelines.
They're
actual
actual
requirements.
codes.
So,
Actual requirements.
yeah, so it's not a choice. But I think to answer your question it's well, if a developer or a builder wants to build a structure that has color X brick or color Y brick, and both of those are permitted, we can't tell them you have to do Y. Does that make sense? So long as it's in the parameters
Right,
of
exactly.
the regulations, then they have that choice to do that.
Well,
Now,
now-
maybe I don't prefer, whitewashed brick, but I can't tell that person he can't use it because it's allowed in the code.
Right.
So,
Bob, does your office vet everything before we see it?
Yes.
And so you're basically comfortable, and this is basically impartial board, review it, ask questions, and suggest. I guess we can't really.
right, you don't
Demand
dictate, but
anything.
I think you have input and
Yeah.
suggestions at
Yeah,
times.
and generally, we try to work with developers, and if this board comes up with ideas, in the past, what they've done is suggested things to developers, and,
Yeah.
if they make sense, the developer generally says, okay, I'll incorporate those ideas. I mean, most people, I'm finding, they don't really come and say, well, that's it, I'm not gonna do it. Most developers really want a nice product, they wanna be part of Milton, and they do listen to the board and say what it is, and things that the board has done in the past. I know the old chairman was very concerned about longevity of materials, so there was always a lot of discussion, because they didn't want to build things and then nobody really maintains things at the end, and then things would start to deteriorate. But everything is vetted to the nines before, it gets here and it's looked at. But it's also, the DRB also serves as a public function too. It's a way to sort of publicly vet and let the community see what's going to be built before the shovels and the blades start coming into the ground. It's a way to publicly vet everything and to show everybody what we're doing.
And go on the record.
And go on the record and things. And, so I think it is, look, we had some discussion previously, like Charlie brought up lighting and said, look, I want to see it more in depth. I want to really review it. And you see the developer just responds and says, okay, I'll look at it and come back to you with more. So even though we're going to grab it, it's kind of, if the board's concentrating on that, then the developer generally responds to it. You'll find most of them do. That's why most of them, when we have comments, they mostly say, okay, we'll just defer and let us go back and sort of work it out and because the whole idea is to incorporate the idea.
Yeah.
Not to just reject it, it's to kind of work with them to
Yeah.
incorporate that idea and give them the opportunity to incorporate it.
Yeah, get to the finish line.
Yeah. And I've never, in all the years I've been here, and Robin's been here, I've never really seen anybody just take that stance that's real hard. And just then, they just generally don't do that.
Well, that was great. Is it possible for us to, there are a couple of slides I wouldn't mind having. Can you give us a link or is there?
Right, yeah, I can have Cody, give you the link for
Okay.
for the PDFs, for the codes. Let me just give a little, whatever, legal thing. There's some things in the PDF that's not totally up to date, and that we just don't have, the manpower to get it up to date all the time. So we do have accurate codes on Unicode, but it's very hard to read on Unicode. So I just want you to know that the PDF is much better to read and understand, but there are some things that have not been updated. So
Sure.
I just want to
The
claim
meaning
that.
code is the legal one.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the legal.
I got
These
it.
are just
So
kind of
It's just-
our references.
it's kind of
They're
like a
nice
pretty
to
book.
read. It's
I
a
mean, it
pretty
is
book.
the same code, but there have been some changes that we haven't been able to update on the website,
Sure.
so just want to give you that. Now, the regulating plans have
complicated.
not changed at all, either of them, Deerfield or
They've been
Crabapple.
there.
So that's totally the same.
Yeah.
So we can send you that, and then, I think there's a website, I'll give you two. It's kind of an association that talks about form-based codes, and you can look up form-based codes in other jurisdictions, and they give prizes for the best form-based codes. So, you can't sleep at night, you can just go to that website and look at form-based codes, see what other jurisdictions do, just, so you have an idea. So I think, get that to you.
Great.
So any other questions, or a little break before you?
Yeah, a little break. I have to go get my stuff.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Again, if you have any other questions, just give me a ring or email me, or actually Bob knows, so he's the expert.
Thank you, Robin.
Okay.